Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for coming. It's nice to see such a large turnout on a rather inclement type of evening. My name is Bert Rude. I'm president of the Metropolitan Washington Old Time Radio Club. This is our January meeting. We have a very special program, which we'll get to in just a minute. Just a few things here. Our first ever recorder, we're now under new bylaws. Our first ever recorder is right up here, and she has information about the club and also information about how to join. We'd love to have you. It's $20 a year, and that gets you 6 issues of Radio Recall. And I think, Marcia, do you have some forms back there too or not? About the club, flyers about the club. See Marcia in the back, one of our librarians, or Sally, and Marcia, and they'll help you. If you choose to come more often, as we'd love to have you do, just let me give you a very quick rundown of what we have coming up in the next few months in terms of programs. Next month, Jeff Whipple, who's sitting back there in the beverage cart, food and beverage cart. The canteen, that's right. There you go. There you go, yes. We'll be doing a program on the lesser lights of radio broadcasting. I think what he's talking about is, what it's like to be Chester. Pardon, not star of the show. What it's like to be Chester rather than Matt Dillon. Right. Okay, March. Jill Errol Bailey will be here from WAMU. Jill Errol Bailey will be here to talk about the radio series Jane Arden, in which her grandmother starred. So, I would be certainly try to come here for that. April. Mr. Jack Burkert. He's senior museum educator for the Baltimore Museum of Industry, is going to be here. And he's going to talk about the golden age of radio inception through the 1960s. So it's a good review for those of us who've been in the hobby for a while. For those of you who don't know much about the hobby, would like to do more, this would be a fabulous time to come and get caught up. And then finally, in May, again, Jeff, along with our webmaster, John Abbott, and some others, are going to do a recreation of the Phil Harris and Alice Faye show. And complete, I suspect, with sound effects. And if you haven't seen sound effects before, huh? Okay, whatever. Okay. All righty. Usually we have a business meeting right at the beginning of our meetings. We're going to push that back until after the break, so that as many of you as possible have an opportunity to get a book and talk with Mr. Kalb about it. And by the way, if you haven't bought the book, the price was even lowered more. I don't know if I put out an announcement saying he's going for a 20% discount, $20. It's now $19.95. Yes. Yelda in the back has nickels. She'll make change. All righty. For tonight's special speech, could you please observe just a few things? Number one, would you please silence the cell phones? Number two, if you could please limit side discussions and walking back and forth, unless you have to walk back to the restroom, of course, and that's allowable. But since that can be real distracting, I'm talking about walking back and forth, not, anyway, okay. And let's see, what else here? Well, I guess that should be enough to do it. It's a great pleasure to have with us tonight one of the icons of radio, who's been in the business now almost was it 50 or is it 60 years with CBS and NBC, as well as a scholar. And I'm not going to talk anything more about him because I think he's pretty well known already. Marvin Kalb, welcome.
Thank you, Bert, very much. Anyone who is a friend of radio is a friend of mine. And I would like to say that for me, radio was the first and most exciting grown-up thing that I did. And when I joined CBS in June of 1957, oh, I didn't know what the... Well, let me continue. When I joined CBS in 1957, I did not have a professional background in broadcasting at all. I was a teacher. I was going on for a PhD at Harvard in Russian history. My life was very much grooved in that direction. And for those of you who get a copy of this book, I turn your attention to the last chapter of the book, which I call Postscript, and it is a sort of funny but remarkable story about a young kid working in the library, and the librarian comes over to him and says, Marvin, there's a guy on the phone who says he's Edwin R. Murrow, and he would like to talk to you. I said, no one, Edwin R. Murrow is not calling me. That is absolutely ridiculous. Hang up on him. Obviously, he's a weirdo. And I continued working. It really went in one ear and out the other very quickly. And late that afternoon, she came back and said, Marvin, it's that same guy who's on the phone. I think you ought to talk to him. He sounds important. So I said, well, what the hell? And I picked myself up and grabbed the phone and said, hello. And the minute I heard his voice, I realized what a total jackass I was. I mean, how do you not talk to Edwin R. Murrow? And he called me down to his office meeting the following day at 9:30 in the morning. We chatted for 3 hours. He asked me every imaginable question about Russia, and he hired me right on the spot. And when he did that, he culminated the hiring by reaching down into the drawer of his desk, and he pulled out, this was 10 o'clock in the morning, he pulled out a bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label Scotch, 2 large glasses, and began to pour. And on my face must have been a look of absolute horror. And he looked at me and he said, oh dear, you don't drink. I said, no, does that mean there's no job? And he said, no, but it does make it that much more difficult. And that really, it's the end of the book, but it is in a way the beginning of my professional life. And the whole idea of broadcasting, I had always listened to Murrow on the air, but I had never been in a studio. I had no idea what any of it was really like. And there was one wonderful man I will never forget named Mwotrc. He was a little guy, kind of chubby. He always wore a New York Yankees baseball hat. And he was the editor, he was the producer, and he was the guy who told me when I went off to Moscow for the first time for CBS, I asked him, I said, how do you broadcast? What do I do? Where do I go? And he said, every one of these European capitals will have a central telegraph agency. Find out where that is. We're going to be connected into that. You go into a room, there's going to be a microphone. Talk to me. I'll be at the other end. And that idea of talking to Hal was a terribly important bit of advice, because the best broadcasting, the art is simply to communicate, to talk to people. And if you have somebody at the end in your mind that you're talking to, it's very it makes it that much more, that much easier to do. And that's what I always tried to do, to talk to somebody. And that was Murrow's advice as well. And I have always looked upon, I'm in the middle right now of doing a book about President Trump's relationship to the media, to the press. And the first quarter of the book, or maybe the first third, is going to be a story of Murrow and Senator McCarthy. And Senator McCarthy, I'm not saying that that is an exact parallel with Trump, but I am saying that McCarthy struck Murrow, who had just come from covering World War II and the fight against Hitler. Murrow had in mind when he saw McCarthy not Hitler, but a threat to the democratic underpinning of American society. And he wanted to stop him. Now, a reporter can't stop him, but what a reporter can do, and what Murrow did so well in a really historic broadcast on March 9th, 1954, was let McCarthy talk. It was a half-hour program. 22 minutes of the half hour was just McCarthy. And all Ed did was simply say, McCarthy on Korea, McCarthy on anything. And at the end of the program, for a minute and a half, Murrow did a commentary which is simply brilliant. And what I found out literally today was that a week before the Murrow broadcast, McCarthy's favorability ratings, according to Gallup, were 50%. But it's hard to understand and even believe that in March of 1954, the only other Republican who had a higher standing than Joe McCarthy in the United States of America was Dwight Eisenhower as president. But McCarthy was second. And after Murrow did the program, his numbers dropped to 32. And that is the power of free, Sacco kind of journalism. And that's what Murrow was capable of doing. Let me back up just a little bit. When I went and spoke to Murrow on that morning, which was a big morning in my life, as you can imagine, I had spent the previous year working at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And just to put your minds back into that frame, remember it was only 10 years after the end of World War II. We were at that time at the beginning of what was called the Cold War. The entire world was split into two parts. There was East and West, communist and capitalist. And these were not words. These represented fundamental points of collision between two systems of government, and more important than that, two ways of looking at human life, whether life would be seen as a free enterprise or whether life was simply part of a government-run structure, and you were a cog in that structure and you had really very little to say about how you were going to be used by the state. You were a tool in the hands of the state. It was a fundamental collision of interest. And in that period of time in the U.S., some of you may remember that there was a phrase, know your enemy. And the idea at that time was the enemy was communism, the enemy was the Soviet Union, the enemy was China, which in 1949 turned communist. And as I say, there was this fundamental collision of interest. And my dear, dear brother, who was 8 years older than I, and is a chipper 95 at this time, Bernie told me when I entered college, try to learn something. Try to leave college with some knowledge that can be used by an editor, a producer, In other words, if you want to go into journalism, and I sort of did, but I wasn't absolutely sure, have some skill that you can give to an editor and say, use me in this capacity. It's not simply a matter of being good at English, and that's enough. And at that time, because Russia was so much the enemy, I took it into my head that I would try to study the Russian language, and then when I was finished with college, I didn't have any money, but try to get a scholarship, a fellowship, something up at Harvard where they had a fantastic program at a place called the Russian Research Center, and it was staffed by a brilliant collection of professors. And I went on up there and studied for 2 years, went into Army intelligence for 2 years, and when I came out and went back to Harvard and had that conversation with Murrow, I was about 6 months away from completing my dissertation. I was on the edge of a career as a teacher, which to this day is what I think I like doing more than anything else. And one day, I got a call, I keep getting these calls, from the fellow who was the deputy head of the Russian Research Center, a guy named Marshall Shulman, who used to be the speechwriter for Dean Acheson when Acheson was Secretary of State. And Marshall said, I just got a call today from the State Department. They need somebody at the embassy immediately, literally next week. But I need somebody who has a clearance, who speaks Russian, who knows a bit about Russia itself, history, economics, politics. And it struck me that you might want to do that. I said, I would love to do that. And he said, well, can I say that I got a yes from you? He said, I said to him, I've got to check with my parents. And he said, he knew my mother and father, and he said, you know the way it's going to work out. I said, yeah, I know. My father's going to say yes, and my mother's going to say no. It's dangerous. Don't go. You know? Which is exactly what happened. And so I went. But I did have a series of briefings here in Washington at the department. And I remember one where they spent a great deal of time trying to persuade me that at age 25, single, totally unattached, I was ripe for plucking. I mean, I was ripe for somebody to come in and just steal me away because I was at the embassy and I would give them all kinds of secrets, which was absurd because I was the lowest ranking person at the embassy. I knew practically nothing. I was an interpreter. I was a translator. I was a young guy who spoke Russian, and the ambassador, Charles Bolin, a brilliant ambassador, marvelous, wonderful, wonderful man. He used me in a nice way. I mean, I would be the guy who went out into the street to talk to Russians, to find out what they were thinking. Because our contact with Russia was very organized, tightly controlled. And if you were sort of a big gawky kid and spoke the language, you could learn things, and that's what I was used for. But believe me, I knew nothing. I really knew nothing. There was an assumption, however, on the part of this guy named Bob, that because I was single, I was ripe for a Russian ballerina to seduce me and get all kinds of secrets out of me. Now, the ballerina wouldn't have known that I knew nothing. And I was listening to this man. He says, you see, this is a very important problem, Marvin. And in my mind, I didn't think of it as that. I thought of it as one of the great opportunities in my young life. I mean, a Russian ballerina, let's face it. Not bad. But let me tell you right now, nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened. So they spent a whole day briefing me on what I was supposed to do. It was all a waste of time. When I went to Russia, this was in January of 1956. As I said, we're in the middle of the Cold War, and relations at that time were not only frosty, they were rather icy. And we did not know at that time, nobody at the embassy knew at that time, that on February 25th of that year, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, would be delivering probably the most important speech that had ever been delivered in the Soviet period in Russian history. And that was a speech at which he ripped into the legend of Joseph Stalin. I cannot tell you in words, because you almost had to have lived it, the impact on the 1,500 people who listened to him was immense. Stalin was for 28 years the absolute dictator of the Soviet Union. And that meant that his word was God's word. No one ever questioned him. And here was Khrushchev denouncing him as a murderer, a killer, a man who almost lost the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany in 1941. He was saying things about Stalin that you could not imagine being said about the worst enemy of the Soviet Union, and yet he said it. We learned later, no Westerner knew that the speech was being delivered. It wasn't on radio or television, anything like that. It was top secret. Ambassador Bolin did not learn that there had even been a speech delivered that was critical of Stalin for 3 weeks. And he learned that at the French embassy, and an Israeli diplomat told him. And that was the only way he knew about it, the only way we in the West knew about it. And it was stunning in the impact that it had upon the Russian people, because you can imagine their God is suddenly a tyrant, suddenly somebody who would have given away the Soviet Union to Hitler. It was stunning. What we learned afterward, weeks and weeks later, was that people literally died of heart attacks listening to the speech. It had that stunning an impact on people. Some of them were seen popping nitroglycerin tablets because of the impact that it was having on their system. And because it was my job to sort of travel around, go around, be around, I began to listen to the Russian people talking about the impact that this had. And it was for the Russian people who had never in their lives experienced individual freedom. It simply was out of their experience, out of their national experience. They were feeling it. They were able to think that they could make a decision on their own. They were beginning to think that communism itself was bad. I was once in the Lenin Library, which is the big library in the Soviet Union in those days, now the Russian library, great library, by the way. And I would go there 2 or 3 nights a week to do some research for my dissertation. I was really doing 2 things. I was doing my academic stuff and the embassy stuff. And at night, I did finally get into the library. It wasn't easy at all. I was the first foreigner who got into the Lenin Library, and honestly, to this day, I haven't a clue as to why the woman who was in charge at that time let me in. I have no idea. But she did, and she gave me a seat in this very large room, which was marked by huge rectangular tables, one after another. And the Russian student is a very serious student, was very quiet, and night after night that I was there was deathly quiet, as a matter of fact, everybody working very hard, doing her thing. And one night in about April, I think it was, or May, and the word about the Stalin speech was all over the country then, a young man stood up broke the silence and began to attack communism. It's hard to I was shocked when I was writing, I was trying to copy something and I was writing, and suddenly I realized that I was listening to a young man in rhetorical rebellion against communism, against a system. It's a big deal. And then someone else stood up and said the same thing. And then people began, one youngster after another stood up and began to attack Khrushchev, began to attack Stalin, began to attack the communist system itself, demanding access to freedom. I mean, the word itself was like setting off a bomb in the middle of a room. And I was copying all of this down. And I, by chance, this is all fluke, I was the source on the youthful rebellion in the Soviet Union in 1956, which is a piece of Russian history which is simply remarkable. And when it was over, I thought these kids, everybody was in it, by the way. They stood on tables. One thing they did, they would take copies of Pravda, the official Communist Party newspaper, and tear it up as a demonstration of their disgust for the whole system. It was a remarkable night. I was there. I was experiencing this several times. And after the first night, I didn't know what to do with all this hot stuff. And so I woke up Ambassador Bolin. I went to Spaso House. And I said, I'm really sorry to wake you, but listen. And he was very excited about it. We went to the embassy, sent off a message to the State Department, and that was the first inkling that the West had of the depth of the impact of Khrushchev's speech on the Russian people. On July 3rd, the night before the July 4th party, Ambassador Bolin gets word from the Foreign Office that Khrushchev and the whole Politburo was going to come the following day to our July 4th party at the embassy. Well, that was a big deal. I mean, Khrushchev and the entire Politburo. So the embassy was woefully understaffed, and there were only 4 of us who spoke Russian. There was the ambassador, 2 very senior political officers, and Pipsqueak Marvin. And the ambassador gave each of us an assignment that when these guys came in the following day, each one of the 4 of us had an assignment. The ambassador, of course, was responsible for Khrushchev. And then he turned to me, a former PFC in the United States Army, and he said, Marvin, you're in charge of Marshal Zhukov. Marshal Zhukov was the Minister of Defense, the hero of the Battle of Stalingrad, the man whose finger was on the nuclear button in the Soviet Union, a great historic military figure. And he says, Marvin, look after him. Well, the night before, I was in a state, as you can imagine, and the night before I went over to Spaso House where the ambassador lived, and I spoke to Tang, who was a Chinese butler. I was always convinced Tang was in the employ of at least 6 secret services all over the place. But he also got paid by us. And I said, Tang, you got to help me here. I have to look after Marshal Zhukov. I've just looked up his file. He loves to drink. He loves vodka, and I don't drink. So what are we going to do? And he thought there for a second, and his imaginative Chinese mind got very active, and he ran into the kitchen. He was there for about 5 minutes, and he came out with an oddly shaped tray. And he said, this is what we're going to do. He said, you're going to be with Marshal Zhukov. I'll walk over to Zhukov this way. On this side of the tray will be vodka. Then I'm going to turn to you. On this side of the tray is water. So that's the deal. I said, great. So the following day, Zhukov arrives. I shook hands with him. I made a little speech. which I had prepared the night before. And I took him out into this beautiful garden that was set up, American flags and hot dogs and caviar and it was a great stuff. Yeah, and we talked for about 45 minutes, and I spoke to him about the battle at Stalingrad. I spoke to him also about Peter the Great's great battle, which was at Poltava in 1709, and he spoke about that. He liked the idea that I knew about Poltava and knew about Peter the Great, and et cetera. So we got on very, very well. And he kept belting back these vodkas. And I counted them. He took 9 vodkas in the space of 45 minutes. I mean, and I took 9 waters in the space. And then Khrushchev beckoned us to come toward him because he was ready to go. So the two of us walked toward him, and I noticed that Zhukov was a little tipsy as he walked over to Khrushchev, and he said in a very loud voice, he said, "Nikita Sergeyevich, I have finally found a young American who can drink like a Russian." And of course, Bolin knew I didn't drink, and he sort of looked quizzically at me. And then Khrushchev comes over to me and he says, he said, "How tall are you?" And because Peter the Great was on my mind, I said, "I'm 6." Peter the Great was 6'8". And I said, "Well, I'm 6 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great." And he loved that line. So he kept calling me Peter the Great, and that was great for my ego. And when I went back for CBS, it was extremely helpful on stories. I mean, there was one story, big story about the U-2 crisis that Khrushchev gave to me strictly because of that Peter the Great connection. And so my responsibility, and I would meet, by the way, I would meet Khrushchev any number of times at other events. What you have to remember is that the impact of the speech that Khrushchev gave was so great that it spilled over the borders of the Soviet Union and went into Eastern Europe. And in June at Poznan in Poland, there were great worker uprisings against the state and against communism, which were crushed. And then it spread into East Germany. Then it spread to Czechoslovakia. All of the students went on strike. This was all a reaction to the Khrushchev speech against Stalin. And you can understand it. These are people who lived under the boot of the Soviet military, and suddenly the guy who runs the Soviet military says that Stalin is a no-goodnik, and that the idea of a little bit of freedom, just a little bit, was acceptable. But then you had, Khrushchev had no understanding of freedom at all. And he thought that you could ration it. You could give 10% freedom to you and 13% to you and 11%. He didn't understand that it is an intoxicating, powerful force. And that once you feel that you are free, you're not going to take any nonsense from the government. And that is what was happening in Eastern Europe. And then finally, in September into October, it got to Hungary. And the Hungarian uprising was something that was in one way majestic and magnificent, and another way painfully sad, because these people expressed their personal desire for freedom, not only for themselves against their system, but for their country against the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev had the most important decision of his life right there. If he had given Hungary the opportunity to go free, to break loose, the whole Warsaw Pact system would have fallen apart. If it had fallen apart, what would Russia have done? Would Russia have simply accepted that, leaned back and said, okay, you can have your freedom? Or do you crush it? And for Khrushchev, the decision was very difficult. I have spoken to his son, Sergei, who lives up, by the way, he lives up in Rhode Island, Cranston, Rhode Island. He is a wonderful, wonderful man. And he has told me that the pain that his father felt was real, but he felt he had no choice. And he sent the Red Army into Budapest and killed an awful lot of people and crushed the uprising. Many times I've been at conferences where people who know the subject have said that actually Khrushchev did us all a favor. That if Hungary had gone free and then Poland had broken off and Romania and Bulgaria, if all of Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, if all of Eastern Europe had broken loose, the center of Europe would suddenly have become so fragile that nobody would have had control over it, and it would have been there in the hot environment of the Cold War. It would have been a prize for both sides, and it could have led to a horrible war. So maybe he did us a favor. I don't buy that. I don't think so for a second. I think what he did was something that Russian leaders like Khrushchev, like Putin today, do essentially to preserve the structure of their state power. And that is what was in Khrushchev's mind back then. And remarkably, and I'll end here and invite any question that you have, in December, a number of us went to, ironically, a National Day party at the Hungarian embassy, which was a very sad place. That's one of the reasons we wanted to go, sort of as a show of support. And Khrushchev showed up. Big deal again. And for the first time since February 25th of that year, Khrushchev declared that when the great history of communism is written, there will be an entire chapter devoted to the genius-like work of Joseph Stalin. And the fact that Khrushchev, who had 10 months earlier denounced him as a killer, as somebody who had corrupted communism, for him to go back at the end to say that he was a great genius on communism, indicated the collapse of Khrushchev's effort at opening up the Russian system. And Khrushchev did something that was so remarkable, even though it ended so tragically, that years later, when Gorbachev came along, Gorbachev called himself a child of the 60s, quote unquote, by which he meant a child of that era of Russian history when we had a moment when we could have had freedom, and then it was lost. And I hope that in this book there is the story of this extraordinary moment in history and the nature of my access to this, which was accidental. It just happened that there was a young guy there who spoke Russian and who was able to listen in on it. But it was, for me, truly one of the great moments in my life, and I was delighted to be able to put it down between hardcovers. Anyway, I thank you all very much. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, everything. Any questions that we have? Sure.
What we will do is Marvin will entertain questions now for a while. And since this is being recorded for our member Tim Eckert, among others, if you have a question, would you please raise your hands and state your question? I'll repeat it for the recording over here, and then Marvin will answer. Go ahead. Mike? did take place with the battle, and Eisenhower's trip to the Soviet Union that summer would have changed the course of the Cold War to some extent?
Do you want to repeat that?
You just want to repeat the question. Repeat the question. We'll get
The question, as I understood it, has to do with the relationship of what I experienced in 1956 with the effort in 1959 with Eisenhower and Khrushchev to meet in Paris at the summit meeting, and whether that would have happened, whether there could have been a breakthrough at that time as well. Unfortunately, it was wonderful that there was the effort made to have the summit meeting in Paris. Let us be clear, the summit meeting never happened. It was broken before. Everybody showed up in Paris, and then Khrushchev said at that time that for this meeting, this summit meeting to continue, there would have to be major changes on Berlin, which was the big issue at that time. More important even than that was the U-2 spy plane. They were planning that U-2 spy plane stuff in 59. It happened in 60. But that was very much in Eisenhower's mind. And Eisenhower being Eisenhower, he did not want to engage unless it was absolutely essential in that kind of super secret, duplicitous stuff. He was very much of two minds on the U-2 stuff at all. And Khrushchev did him a favor by breaking up the summit, using Berlin as Khrushchev's excuse, and not giving Eisenhower an opportunity really to feel quite awful about dealing with Khrushchev. I have always had a feeling that that was overdrawn. I think that Eisenhower would have been perfectly delighted to meet with Khrushchev. Eisenhower had been on very good terms with Marshal Zhukov. The two of them knew each other very well. Ike believed that at the Geneva Summit in 1955, where he had a special session with Marshal Zhukov, and the two of them really had a discussion which was as political and diplomatic as it was military. And Ike left that meeting feeling that though he had to talk with Bulganin and Khrushchev, really what was happening was what Ike and Zhukov had to say to each other. So Ike had a special feeling that he could do something with the Russians. And that is why the crushing of the Hungarian Revolution, and then Khrushchev's determination not to look weak to his hardline people at home and to stress Berlin as a make-or-break point. You accept our position on Berlin or we're not going to talk to you. That was, in fact, what ended up happening. And again, it was one of those moments when something could have happened, but didn't. The many times in the Cold War when we approached a break and neither side had the guts to do it. I think that you had your hand up.
Yes. I was wondering what is the best thing about being a reporter and what is the worst thing?
There's an answer to that. The best thing about being a reporter is that it's the best job in the world. You get up in the morning having not a clue as to what you're going to learn that day. And then something happens that you didn't know anything about. And you've got to figure it out. And you've got to study it. And you've got to talk to people. The excitement of discovery on an almost daily basis is fabulous. The opportunity of meeting historic figures, so that when you're an old man and you pick up a history book, you can look back, not often, but often enough, and say, I knew that guy. I talked to this guy. I mean, the opportunity of traveling through the Middle East with Henry Kissinger in 1973, 4, 5, and meeting Arab leaders whom I would never have met, was a graduate school education that I didn't have to pay for. In fact, they overpaid me. So the worst thing about it is something that's happening right now, but even I'm not covering Trump, so in that sense, I'm happy about that. When people you respect, and for me that is not Trump, let me be clear about that. But when people you respect lie, and you discover the lie, and then you find him or her, but mostly him. In those days, it was almost always him. And you say, excuse me, Henry Kissinger. I said in a broadcast yesterday that your position was ABC. And you had a news conference today, and you said that that was wrong, that it was CBA. And you and I both know that's not true. Why did you do that? And when they look at you and say that CBA is the same as ABC, that's extremely disheartening. It's a terrible feeling that, see, part of it is that I had my first big foreign experience in the Soviet Union, which was a communist dictatorship. And I felt at that time, and I feel to this day, that what we represented in those years was something a hell of a lot better than what the Russians had. And I was proud of that. And I felt that when, when Russians would say to me things that were simply not true, I was able to explain that away. Well, they live in the system, what can you do? They'll get into trouble, all that. But when your own Secretary of State or today President systematically lies to you and therefore to the American people and therefore defames democracy in my judgment, that's a bad thing. And I feel very bad about that. That's the big negative on that. Yes, please.
I was going to ask you two questions, but your response to Edgar kind of answered it. I don't know whether you would still go to journalism. That would be my
No, go ahead.
Yeah, but I do want to ask about the upcoming book, which I look forward to. You talked about Edward R. Murrow and Joseph McCarthy, and I hope this can be reinterpreted for the microphone. And my impression of that whole impact of Edward R. Murrow is because people didn't know, right? Media were so different at the time, right? And all he had to
about what time especially?
well, the 50s, Edward R. Murrow,
Okay.
right? And so all he had to do, and I say all in quotes, is tell people, because people had much less access to media generally, and it wasn't 24-hour a day and 7 days a week. So all he had to do was tell people. But today, people know. People know what the president says. They know 24 hours a day what the president says. They have people, eloquent people, repeating it to us and interpreting it, We have Edward R. Murrow today, and we know 24 hours a day what happens in the White House, and it doesn't seem to move the needle, right? So I guess I'm a little frustrated, and maybe this isn't what you're saying, but I guess I'm a little frustrated when people say, well, if we just know what the president is saying, then we will think differently on this. Well, I don't know that that's true, and I wonder whether you agree with that premise, and if so, what do you do if just information doesn't seem to change people's perception?
Yeah, let me try to figure this out here for a second. Okay, there we go. It's a very hard question to answer. Because you're asking for an analysis of not only the media, but also the way the Trump operation works. The amazing thing with this president is, and you're absolutely right, we know a great deal. This new book that came out last week has told us nothing new. It's all stuff we've been reading about for weeks and months. But it created a big stink because it all came together. And it was as if, you know, I'm a baseball fan. It's as if you just found the ball just right and whacked it. And that's what Michael Wolff did. There's a strange thing that is going on now. A president who systematically lies. I do not mean someone like Richard Nixon who lied for a specific political purpose. Richard Nixon was an accomplished, professional politician. He knew what he was doing. He did it to extreme, but he knew what he was doing. I believe that this president lies often without even knowing that he's lying, that there are expressions and thoughts that pop into his mind at a certain time in the day or night, and he'll put it out at Twitter, and the minute he reads it on Twitter, it suddenly becomes not a fleeting thought in his mind, but a fact. He read it. And therefore, it happened. And we are now, as a nation, in hot water. Because if you, around the world, I mean, this thing that, I'm not getting into words now, but what the president said yesterday about a number of countries, I cannot imagine that happening. I truly cannot imagine a president of the United States saying that. I don't care what he even thought, but you don't say it. And he does, because he wants to be in the middle of everything. He told his White House staff, and this was reported by several very good reporters, especially Peter Baker at the New York Times, that Trump has told his staff that he wants them to think of what's going on at the White House as a reality television show. And every day there is an event, and we focus on that event. And then the next day we forget about what happened the day before. You go on to another event, and everything is to achieve highest possible ratings. Step by day after day after day. That is not the way the U.S. government works. I am sort of rambling here, and forgive me, but we're dealing with something that is very new. We have not had, fortunately, we have not had this experience before. And not only the people in the United States, not only the Congress, the whole world is adjusting to what it is that this one man is thinking and doing at this time. Everyone in the world honored Ike. You had to, because of who he was, what he did, what he represented. And you sort of want, as an American citizen, to have your highest official, not necessarily in agreement with you, but to represent the nation in a way that is honorable. That is not happening. And, you know, how does a reporter deal with this? It's incredibly difficult. It really is. For example, up until this president, the New York Times and most of journalism never would use the word lie to describe what a president said. They would say, President said X yesterday and today he said Y, And this difference seems to be unexplained. And I mean, there are 100 ways in which you can deal with that. The New York Times now uses the word lie. That means the President of the United States. We're not talking about, Joe Smith who runs the store. We're talking about the President lying. What then do you believe? If everything is fake news, that is news that criticizes the President or points out something negative about the President, he denounces as fake news. Think about this. You are all citizens of this country. A major issue comes up. Your savings may have to go toward taking care of this problem. Your son or daughter may have to go off to fight for this problem. There are all kinds of things that are going on, but then you can say to yourself, wait a minute. Is it true? Is the reason that I'm sending my son to war what the President says it is? If it's already a matter, if already there's the possibility of lying, how are you going to feel? I mean, it undercuts the very nature of our democratic system.
This is no wonder his wife cried.
Yeah, well, go ahead.
Changing the subject a little bit,
Go ahead.
did you finish your dissertation?
No.
Secondly, did you ever cover any actual wartime?
Yes. Yes, in the Middle East. I was about to say it was my pleasure. No, it was not. I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But in the 1973 war in the Middle East, that was a time when I was involved in the coverage of war. Today, it's different from the way it was, for example, during the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, CBS had a rule that my brother and I were at CBS at the same time. And CBS's rule was that two members of the same family could not be in a war zone at the same time. So they alternated. And Bernie was there most of the time. I was the diplomatic correspondent, so I was hiding out back here. But I would be going there on occasion. Bernie was there all the time. In the Middle East, I was there all the time. And that was, it's a funny thing. You're not frightened. I don't think reporters are frightened. We used to think, as a matter of fact, that a bullet, if shot at us, would come up to here and then go around and continue. That as reporters, we were immune. But of course, that has changed totally. With the advent of terrorism now and the idea that a reporter can be picked up and murdered, beheaded, and that has happened. So right now, it's totally different. I am filled with admiration for the young women especially, who, in order to crack through, go off to cover wars in the Middle East. I think that some of them are utterly heroic in the way in which they do that. And why do they do that? Because they want to break through, and you cover a war, and that's one way of doing it. So the reasoning is wrong, but it's totally understandable. But today, the coverage of war is a much more dangerous thing. Also, the technology is such that you are expected to do live programs from the battlefront. That means you don't have a chance to sit there and think through what it is that you have just seen. You have to talk about something as it's happening, and you better be right. and not every one of us is always right. So you get mistakes, and there could be a mistake in any industry with any business. But reporters today are so central a part of our lives. We look at them all the time, and for that reason, we expect them to be flawless, and no one is. And that gives Trump another opportunity of, if there's anything that goes wrong, you leap at it and make a big deal about it, and that also fits this whole framework of fake news, what is described as fake news. Yes, sir?
Yeah, to continue on that, with the Vietnam War, that was a big part of my generation. I lost a lot of buddies over there. But from your personal experiences, do you have any interactions or in covering it, or maybe talking to folks like covering folks like LBJ, McNamara, Green Russ, Westmoreland?
Yes.
Maybe you can talk maybe a little bit about that, reporting on that.
Yes. I have had trouble with presidents in my coverage. Richard Nixon put me on his enemies list, and LBJ no. He was I sort of liked LBJ a lot. He was doing great things for the country, but he got involved with the war and couldn't work his way out of it. And the war utterly destroyed him, actually killed him. Another thing with a president like Kennedy, because of the Harvard overlap, there was always the feeling on the part of the people around Kennedy that Harvard reporters would treat him very well. And if we didn't, they were really upset, and especially Bobby Kennedy, and the word would come back to us about how the president is furious. I mean, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it was all over on a Sunday, I was the first reporter to break that news on Sunday, and we had a live feed from Moscow direct to CBS and out on the network. And the announcement by the Russians that they're pulling their missiles out of Cuba was obviously in Russian. I understood it, and I had a live mic, and I was feeding the announcement as it was happening through to New York. And when I heard them say that they were, and therefore removing our missiles from Cuba, I broke in and obviously in English said, the Russians have just announced the withdrawal of their missiles from Cuba. And I then continued with the Russian track, I remember, and then came back to say what had just happened. And I used the word caved, the verb caved, that the Russians have caved to Kennedy's insistence on the removal of missiles, which is what they did. It's a fascinating story here. That went out, and Kennedy heard that. So Kennedy had Pierre Salinger, his spokesman, call CBS in New York to get to me on the line, which was open and live, and whisper in my ear that the president does not want you to use the word caved. Because he didn't want Khrushchev to feel cornered and that he would snap back and do something crazy. And I understood it from the president's point of view, but Khrushchev caved. And so I said it again. And the president was disturbed. He was very disturbed. Lyndon Johnson used to he used to say, in order to upset me, he would never pronounce my name Kalb. He would say Clab. He would flip, and he would say, "Get that string bean Clab over here," and he would be very vulgar, but in a charming way. I mean, you almost knew why he was so upset. I mean, if I were in his shoes, I'd be upset too. But anyway, I could go on, but yes, in the back. The Korean one, no, I'm not that old. Yes, in the back.
In your many years, what I'm found over the years watching news, we've gotten to the point where we monetized it.
Speak a little louder, please.
I feel that at times we've monetized the news. Ever since when I was growing up, it was, it's set apart. It was part of the public trust. You were given the keys to broadcast and make money, but the news was sacred. But as time went on, it seemed like it got folded into the information entertainment business. And I was wondering, since you've been this long career, how did you feel when it became that?
It's a wonderful question. In my experience, it happened in the early 1980s. And there was a moment for me when I was covering the attack on Pope John Paul II. That was in May of 1981. He was shot. The bullet went within a micro inch of his heart to kill him, but he was a strong man, and he came through it, as we know. The question was, the man who shot him was a man named Mehmet Ali Agca. He was a Turkish killer. He was a known killer, and he wanted to kill the Pope. Now, the question was, why would a Turkish killer want to kill the Pope? What's in it for him? So who was paying him? Who was moving him in this direction? And his mother, Agca's mother, lived in the far eastern corner of Turkey. And I was in Rome, and I wanted to get to the mother as quickly as I could. And what I did was something that I would have done and did do any number of times before. I chartered a jet plane. I took my crew, I took 2 or 3 producers, and we flew off there. It cost a lot of money. No one ever said anything to me. However, about a month or 2 later, when I sent in an expense account, which, it's interesting, which had, I forgot what the hell it was some big shot, and I decided that I would be the big shot, and there was a group of 12 people, and it was a big dinner here in Washington, and I was with NBC then. I picked it up and paid for it and put it in. And I got a call, the first time in my life. I got a call, and they said, $1,800 for dinner? I mean, whatever it was, I don't know what it was. A lot of money, and they challenged me. And because it was the first time, my first instinct was to walk away. I mean, quite literally, I would pack up and leave. But I spoke to my brother, and my brother said, just calm down, kiddo, and just explain to them what happened. And I did. It was that expense account, for me, was the symbol of a new approach toward money. And that started in about 82 or 3. And from that time on, a terrible thing happened in television news, by the way. You said a moment ago that there was an Edward R. Murrow today. There is no Edward R. Murrow today, and there cannot be one today. Right now, the person who handles the money in any unit on television news is the person who determines whether a story is worth the money. If I wanted to go to Eastern Turkey again, what would have happened, put that all up to today, I would have had to go to our the bureau chief in Rome, who would talk to his or her money person in Rome, who would talk to the money person in New York, who would talk to the president of the company in New York to get the clearance to come on back to say, go ahead and do it. And the likelihood is they would say it's not worth the money. And that idea about something not worth the money, that decision being made not by a journalist, but by a money person is wrong. It's just wrong. But that's where we are today. I'm running out of voice. If you have another question or two, I'd be happy to.
Any other questions?
Yes, please.
Don't strain your voice too much. I'm curious how you see the coverage of Hillary, who seems to come across in the press very stereotyped.
I think the coverage of Hillary Clinton during the campaign of 2016 was terrible. Yeah, I thought the coverage was terrible. I think that there was a narrative in the mind of the people who do cable news that she's the bad guy, and everything that Clinton did was either bad, suspected of being bad, deserving of an investigation. They're still investigating her. And the thing goes on because it is, I think there's a little bit of sexism involved in this thing too, that if she were a man, I'm not sure it would be happening. I'm not saying that it happens because she's a woman, but it's easier. It sort of fits into a mindset that, also remember, Hillary Clinton was running after 8 years of a black man being president of the United States. For a lot of people in this country, it was intolerable that a black man was president of the United States. Then on top of that, to have a woman? No. In other words, it had reached a point where the American, where 62 point something million Americans could not tolerate that thought. And therefore, they were ready to roll the dice on anybody. And we now have...
Okay, one more. Can we take one more
Well, sure.
question? Jim?
When you were in Russia,
Yes.
I assume the Russians had the U.S. embassy bugged.
Yes.
Did you operate under that assumption?
Oh, absolutely. We operated on an assumption that every room, everything was bugged. And therefore, what many of us did was you went out into the street and you would take long walks and then you would talk. There was one room on the 8th floor of the embassy that theoretically was bug-free, and that was where the ambassador would speak to the Secretary of State. Or he would have a private meeting of his own people in this very small, claustrophobic room. But in the backyard, it's interesting, in the back of the embassy building, there's a courtyard, and even the courtyard was bugged. The Russians had ways of just aiming beams in there and picking up conversation. We made an assumption everywhere that we were bugged. That's the way you lived.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry we have to cut off the questions, but we have a couple of things that need to be done. Number one is allow Marvin to get back there and for you to get back there and get your book signed with him. And so he'll head on back there. And the other thing is that we're up against the deadline. Marvin has to leave by 9:30. So, so what we're going to do, we're going to take a break. It'll be a longer break than usual to allow all of you who want to get back there and meet him. And if things are, I'll watch it. We've got a few items of business to take care of, but we'll do that in 15, 20, 25 minutes hence. So thanks, everybody. Okay, thanks, everybody. Just a few things here. Number one, I want to welcome back Mark Paulette. Mark, sure good to see you. Thanks for coming. I also would like to recognize Monique Miller. Would you please raise your hand? Where are you from, Monique? Philadelphia suburbs, and she heard about this program and drove down here from Philadelphia to be with us tonight. Let's see, I'm looking for anybody else that should be recognized here. Or are we kind of back to the regular crew here? I guess pretty much we are. Okay. Yeah, Mike.
This is Bill T. Bill T and I, back in 1990 to about 92, ran the tape library when the club met down at 4600 Duke Street. We were the tape library way back then.
Wow, Bill, thanks. It's good to see you here, Bill. Yeah, Bill's come back. Okay, just a few items. Number one, the club has purchased, the club, I did. Under the bylaws, I've got a little discretion. But if it's, let me do it this way. Is it okay if the club purchases a copy of this for Tim Eckerd? Okay. Is there a motion? Aye, okay. Okay, second. All in favor? Aye, great. Fine, thank you. Thinking that you might think that way, I went ahead and had Marvin sign it to Tim, and then Fred is going to give it to Tim. I would now like to call on our dictator of not dictator. Our election secretary for some business, please. Lawrence.
Your election chairman will be more than happy to undertake two activities. One is to call up. The president has requested that we do this more formally. The president has requested that we do this in a more formal manner. So for the first time ever, we are going to perform an oath of office ceremony. So if the newly elected officers of the club would please come up here. We have Bert as president. We have Jim as vice president. And we have... here, Jim. Yes, you do. They've all gone home, I think. So, drift a little to the right,
Drifting. I'm drifting.
And there's Bert. Okay.
Right here, Jim.
Okay, and then Joni we have as our membership chairperson as well as treasurer. And we have Sally as our recorder, busily recording. Okay. All right. And if you guys want to maybe shove over a little so you can get us all in the picture here. Okay. All right. No, stay. No, that's fine.
Stand over there, we'll clap.
Okay. All right. Please raise your right hand. All one, yeah. Take your pick. Do you solemnly affirm that you will strive to the best of your ability to carry out the duties and responsibilities of the office to which you have been elected, that you will uphold the bylaws of the Metropolitan Washington Old Time Radio Club, and that you will at all times endeavor to fulfill the highest personal and professional standards of which you are capable?
I do.
Oh,
Then by the authority vested in me as elections chairman by the MWOTRC, I hereby declare you officially installed. Then we will recreate the ceremony, now that, as I understand, Dennis, you have gotten the Coelty Award inscribed?
Put you back here. Okay, just a second.
At the luncheon, we had an unofficial handing off of the Coelty Award from me, who had it last year, to Bert, who was selected to have it this year. And we, in the interim, had Dennis, who wonderfully volunteered with a little twist of the arm, to have it engraved officially. And I'm going to present it now to Bert, and he will have control of this award plaque for 1 year. And at the same time, he will also receive an engraved Jefferson Cup, which is his to keep in perpetuity. So, Bert, if you'd come back. There you are. Okay, there you go. Somebody have some photo equipment here. Okay, all right.
Okay.
Bert, I hand you the Coelty Award. Okay, we got photos. Okay, all right. Fred, we're good. Okay,
Okay.
good. And
Thank
I'll give
you.
you the.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
Oops. Hold on. Okay. Okay. Good. That's fine. Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
And then the.
Thank you.
I just had it. You just had it. The disappearing Jefferson Cup. And there you are. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for
Enjoy
all your
it.
efforts.
Enjoy it.
Thank you. Thank you again, as I said before at the December luncheon. It means a lot, so I really appreciate it. Let's see here. At this point, a little bit speechless here. I don't think we have an awful lot. Well, let's put this. There's always all kinds of things we can talk about. No, we don't have to. I figured that'd be the. No, haven't we had a program already? Wasn't that rather extraordinary? Living history, yeah, living history. So there's some things. Oh, just a couple of other things. Some of you, I think Jack forwarded report on Linnell Herbert Marshall's husband Edward, who took a real nasty fall. And if you want to send a card or anything to Edward, Jack sent out Edward's address. If you don't have it, let me know and I can send it out as well. Speaking of Jack, he's under the weather, nothing serious, just a hacking cough and cold. So he regretfully said he would not be able to be here tonight. Fred, would you like to give a little report on Tim, since I know you visited him not too long ago?
It's been several weeks since I visited Tim, but he was in pretty good spirits for the condition that he has. And his wife was very kind to me. In fact, the time before, she fixed lunch for both of us, and I had lunch with him upstairs. And I just admire him. I brought some things with me the last time. I collect everything. I'm a collectaholic. You name it, I collected. But I had a newspaper from his hometown, and the newspaper is 200 years old. And he was amazed that I had this newspaper. The reason I had it, it had an article about my university, Miami University of Oxford, Ohio, and they were, about 30 years old at that time, and they were expanding the campus, and it had a big article in there. And then I collect movie star autographed photos and that, and I had Fay Ray from the famous movie and showed that to him. And we were both Buckeyes from Ohio, so I went for a half-hour visit there and stayed almost 5 hours. And we talked about everything in the world. Our hometowns are not that far apart, and we're both Cincinnati Reds fans, so we talked about the Reds and the famous radio announcer, Wade Hoyt, who used to be the roommate with Babe Ruth. And in those days when we listened to the radio, when they played away games, the announcers didn't follow the team. They stayed back in Cincinnati. And during periods of rain, when the game was halted for some time, Wade Hoyt would relate these Babe Ruth stories. So anyway, the 5 hours went by like, 5 minutes. So enjoyed visiting with him, and we always ended with a prayer.
Thank you so much, Fred. Yeah, thanks for doing that. We really appreciate that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. There are a couple of other things that I'd put on the docket, but why don't we hold off unless there's a demand that we continue. And if there is a demand that we continue, it will be a first, I suspect. No, I've asked Marcia to prepare a report on some of the holdings as to what she recommends as to retention or maybe culling or whatever, and she will do that next month. Joni prepared for us, and you don't have to give it tonight, but next month, would you please, remember you broke down for Jack the membership?
I have it.
Oh, good. Well, let's take the time, because it's very interesting. Go ahead.
We have 114 members. We have 114.
Right to the mic, sorry.
Okay.
Right.
All right, well, it needs to come way down for me. Is that good? Oh, all right, well, we'll see. Is that okay? No? Yes? Yes, okay. We have 114 paid members. Our biggest membership group is from Virginia. We have 34 members in Virginia. And Maryland, we have 21. And what I thought was most interesting was the fact that the next biggest group is from California, which I thought was very, we have 9 from California and 6 from Pennsylvania, and it goes on down from there. We've got them from, I guess probably 16 states. Not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of anybody out of the country. No, not that I'm aware of. So, but we just thought that it was an interesting mix of people. So.
Very interesting. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, Joni. I found it interesting. Would you say 20 from Maryland?
21.
21.
Thanks to Mark Paulette, it was 20.
Oh, okay. It would be nice if we could figure out some way to capture more of those Marylanders. What's this? It'd be fun to get more of them to our meetings if we could figure out a way to do that. Okay. Incidentally, one thing I found interesting as to what was not on the list. I can remember in previous years we had 2 persons from Augusta, Maine. 2 persons, Augusta, Maine, different addresses. I wouldn't want to speculate why, but I see they didn't renew. Okay. Do we have anybody else have anything to bring up here at the meeting here? Oh, Marcia, did you have something?
No, answer that.
Okay.
I have a book that I would be willing to give away, or we can wait until the next meeting.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. You came up with this idea of a raffle, didn't you? Yeah. What should we do? Do we be what? Everybody contribute $1? Should we wait till the next meeting? Good. Why don't you bring to the next meeting?
Okay.
Because we'll have plenty of time then.
It was.
Go ahead.
I wanted to do a little research on CBS broadcasting and news, and I found that I had 2 copies of this book, Edward R. Murrow, and Birth of Broadcast Journalism, that was written by Bob Edwards, who came to our meeting and talked to us. Well, he gave me a copy, an autographed copy, but I already had one, so I'll raffle this off next week.
Great.
Or the next meeting, and so it sort of fits in the subject that we had.
Sure
today.
does. Sure did.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, John. We appreciate it. Alrighty, we'll do that. What'll it be? A buck a ticket or something for next time? Free. Oh, free. Oh my. Oh, okay, fine. If you want to do it that way too. Okay. I was trying to think of ways to make some more money for the club, but well. Okay. Anyway, it's been a good but a long night. I thank all of you for coming. We had, I think, the last one I count 36 people, which is 39. Thank you. 39. That's okay. It's been moved that we adjourn. All those in favor? Aye. Okay. Opposed? Thank you much. Thank you.